me tell you, it's great to be in a warmer province this morning. Yeah, yesterday was like minus 30 Calgary, so I'm excited to be here. Got a lot of good topics that have been opportunity that this province has ahead of it. Let's get to the slides here. This is all the data is fresh, but the story that BC has, a lot of is endowed with terrific oil and gas resources. Is not really new, but it just the opportunity is sort of here, and it has been for years. But I think really, if you look at the year kind of 2030 to 2040, I think that's going to be a massive, and all the decisions we make right now are going to. Today. So, first off, just a bit of kind of nomenclature. 1 BCF a day of gas is a billion cubic feet of gas. BC produces about 8 BCF a day of gas today, consumes maybe a couple domestic within the province. And so there's really more.
Is it going in and out, or
sorry?
Is it going in and out, or
no? Nothing as in that. I'm just using this.
You can support
I don't know.
up to 6 1 gigawatt data centers.
Even him doesn't have.
A significant emission reduction. When we often in Canada, pipelines are in the news frequently. They're very expensive, and they're very key pieces of infrastructure. But when you look at the vast amount of infrastructure that's already in the ground today, one additional pipeline is really not that significant. 5 million kilometers of pipeline kind of sit in the ground across North America and power our quality of life. When we look at Canadian production of natural gas, as a country, we produce around 20 BCF a day. The U.S. produces about 110 BCF a day, so the U.S. is a much larger producer of gas. Right in the 2010s, the shale boom unlocked resources, and particularly gas resources across North America, to the degree we haven't seen really ever before over such a short timeline. The rocks in Canada are just as good, if not better, than the rocks in the U.S. But Canadian production is roughly flat over that period, right? Maybe up a few BCF a day, which BC is a growing share. The reason why is because we don't have a huge industrial sector to consume this cheap gas in Canada, and we don't have the export infrastructure to grow volumes significantly. We did, the first LNG Canada cargoes were shipped last year, and they're continuing to ship today. So that is a very important and tremendous first step in terms of export infrastructure. But there's a lot more to do, is the main takeaway of this presentation. The big part of why the US has grown from 60 BCF to 110 BCF a day over the last 15 years is primarily due to replacing coal on a economic competitiveness standpoint. The US government did not subsidize natural gas and hurt coal this wasn't a transition that was sort of manufactured by government subsidies. This was just an economic transition. Gas got really cheap, and they started building a lot of gas turbines to replace coal-fired generation on the power side in the US. And the US added around 15 BCF a day export capacity in the last 10 years. So the US has built export capacity, and eating into that coal base has really contributed to their ability to grow gas production. This is, maybe a interesting slide in terms of just how big the Montney play is in Alberta and BC versus some of these key American basins and other Canadian plays. So from an undeveloped dry gas resource perspective, you can see that the Montney on the left-hand side of the chart is the largest gas play in North America. Now, that's both from a total scale of undeveloped resources as well as the economic quality of those resources. 70% of that remaining gas resource sits in this province. So it's actually not in Alberta, it's in this province. And so if you just were looking at the BC side of the Montney, it would still be like 250 TCF of remaining gas resource. And so the main point of this is that Canada's got a lot of gas. Again, not a surprise, but nice to have some data around it. When we think about, from a capitalization standpoint, how much activity and how much production we have in the country relative to the US, the resource endowment is much longer lived, right? So in the US, frankly, over the next 10 to 15 years, they're starting to run out of high quality resources from a natural gas and oil standpoint. But in Canada, we have well over 30 years. And much of that is, you can look at it like we have a lot more rock. It's not really we have more rock, we just haven't capitalized it as intensely as the basins in the US. And so that's primarily because we don't have that industrial sector and we don't have enough pipeline capacity to export gas out of the country. Just to drive the point home further, when we think about the prices that Canadian producers receive when they sell their gas at AECO, which is the largest natural gas benchmark price in the country, they're generally receiving anywhere from 40 to 60 to 70% of Henry Hub price, which is priced in Louisiana, and that's the North American benchmark price, or the American benchmark price. And so this discount has really exacerbated over the last, call it 5 to 10 years. And that's driven by all this low-cost Montney gas getting developed and putting pressure on our pipelines. All the pipelines in Canada are effectively full in terms of exporting to the US. And so as you add export capacity on the west coast of British Columbia, you'll be able to increase prices for producers, which increase government revenue, and ultimately improve jobs, GDP growth for the province. This is a little bit of a complicated slide, but I think helps drive the potential for Canada in our view in terms of export potential. So today, exporting around a BCF a day, and LNG Canada will ramp up to 2 BCF a day over the following months. The target in our minds in terms of the projects that will likely get done will get us to like 6 to 7 BCF a day, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. That's sort of like the pretty low bar, I would say, that Canada's setting for itself in terms of getting more gas exported. But given the x-axis, which is the amount of reserves that are identified, we could be exporting, well in excess of 20 BCF a day in our view. So if you just look at the rocks, and if you had ability to build in this province very quickly, you would be able to get to 20 BCF a day kind of no problem. But obviously it's difficult to build these days, and so we're not there. For example, countries like Qatar, United States are definitely have a little bit more natural gas resources, but they're ramping up in terms of export capacity. You could argue the U.S. is like overly building export capacity relative to the reserves they have in the ground, which is definitely an interesting dynamic. But there's no doubt there's room for Canada to think bigger and go after this opportunity with more more emphasis. Part of the reason why we're excited about that as an investment theme is the fact that Asian demand growth is actually really, really strong. It's true that in North America, natural gas, and particularly in Canada, natural gas demand isn't really growing very much, right? It's growing, mainly from oil sands development. Natural gas demand is growing. Otherwise, it's not a growthy sector on the demand side. But in Asia, a lot of these countries are hydrocarbon starved. They need more gas, and we have it here in this country. And so we anticipate Asian demand is going to grow roughly 5 BCF a year for the next, 10, 20 years. It's pretty easy to model, pretty steady growth year on year. A big assumption that folks, often talk about is just how much coal does China ultimately want to displace. And this has their coal consumption roughly flat. They've been growing coal consumption. So we're not saying coal is going to decline in this forecast. We're just saying it's roughly flat. So the market's there for our gas. The province of BC is in a great position geographically to ship gas to Asia. It's only about 10 days to ship gas from the west coast of British Columbia to Japan versus the US Gulf Coast, which is the largest natural gas exporting region in the world. That takes 24 days. So that shipping cost delta is actually meaningful. When we look at different projects and we try to take the CapEx that they've spent on these projects, and if you were to rebuild that project today, so from a greenfield CapEx standpoint, what would the break even of those projects be? We think some of the Canadian projects, particularly LNG Canada and Cedar, would be able to be better on an economic basis than the US Gulf Coast projects, given that shipping cost delta and the cheaper cost of our gas, given the resources that we're endowed with. What's really interesting, and I was thinking of Richard's talk this morning, mentioning the federal government has ambition to ramp natural gas exports via LNG to 100 MTPA. Now that would be, the funny thing is about these targets is they would have already achieved that if all the projects that were proposed on the west coast of British Columbia got done on the timeline that they expected, that the sponsors of the project expected them to get done. So if you greenlit all the projects that were proposed over the last couple decades on the west coast of British Columbia, we would already be exporting 20 BCF a day, which is over 100 MTPA, which is the federal government's target. So it's just kind of this funny dynamic where we set these targets that sound ambitious and exciting, but could have already been done. When we look at where we're at today in terms of export capacity, we're going to be exporting 2 BCF a day, so could have been 10x higher. This is our outlook for the export capacity projects that we do think will get done over the next 5 years. And it's no small feat. All these projects have been 10-year development, so it takes a long time to get these projects done. And that makes sense. They're big industrial projects. I think LNG Canada's plus Coastal GasLink, which is the pipeline that feeds it, it's going to be $40 billion at the end of the day. So they're expensive projects. They take a lot of time. So we need, in order to build the next decade of projects, 2030 to 2040, we need to get them greenlit now. Most of these projects are in the Kidmat area, outside of Silisms, which is north of Prince Rupert, and obviously Woodfibre, which is in the Squamish region. If you compare Canada's export capacity, the slate of projects that we think will get done versus the U.S., although they're exporting around 15, 16 BCF a day today, they're getting to 40 by 2035. So they're not slowing down. And this number could go up, right? If Canada doesn't add projects sort of now to fill the 2030 to 2040 demand piece, the US will develop them at the end of the day. So it is an important kind of timing component that things get moving today. And I'll wrap here. When we look at that demand growth versus the supply growth globally, we do think there's a gap in the 2030s to build more LNG. Like the market opportunities there, we think there roughly could be at least 6 more LNG Canada sized projects that easily could get done in that decade. And it could really benefit the province and the country. We have the rocks, clearly, we have the resources. I actually think the capital is not a problem in the world. It's really just the regulatory and kind of the will to get them done. And with that, I'll leave it. Thank you.